Think about the last time someone made you feel guilty for something. You know you didn't do wrong. Not a big dramatic moment. Just a quiet, everyday situation where someone said something or did something, and suddenly you found yourself apologizing or overthinking or feeling responsible for a problem that had nothing to do with you. You walked away from that conversation feeling heavy, a little confused, maybe even angry at yourself. But here's the thing, and this is what most people never figure out. That feeling wasn't an accident. That confusion, that guilt, that sudden self-doubt, it was engineered. Someone, whether they were fully conscious of it or not, used your own emotions against you. And the scariest part is that it probably worked. Not because you're naive, not because you're weak, but because nobody ever sat you down and showed you exactly how this happens. Today, that changes. Because once you understand the mechanics of emotional manipulation, how it works, why it works, and specifically why it works on people who are actually intelligent and emotionally aware, you will never be caught off guard in the same way again. This isn't about becoming cold or suspicious of everyone in your life. It's about becoming literate, emotionally literate in a way that most people simply are not. And that literacy is the difference between being someone who gets played and being someone who sees the play before it even begins. If this is the kind of psychological depth you've been looking for, you're in exactly the right place. This is Shadow Doctrine, and if you're new here, hit subscribe and drop a like on this video right now. Not as a favor to us, but because the content we create here is specifically designed for people who want to understand the human mind at a level that most platforms never go. You belong here. Now let's get into it. Here's something that will probably surprise you. Research in social psychology consistently shows that the people most vulnerable to emotional manipulation are not the least intelligent people in the room. They are often the most empathetic, the most conscientious, the people who genuinely care about how others feel, who take their relationships seriously, who believe in fairness and honesty and treating people with respect. These are the people who get used most often. And the reason is almost painfully logical once you see it. Empathy, when it exists in a person who doesn't fully understand how manipulation works, functions like an open door. A person who feels deeply, who doesn't want to hurt others, who gives people the benefit of the doubt. That person can be redirected, guilt-tripped, destabilized, and controlled far more easily than someone who simply doesn't care. This is not an argument for caring less. It's an argument for understanding what you're dealing with so that your genuine, valuable qualities stop being used as leverage against you. Let me paint a picture that might feel familiar. Imagine someone in your life, a partner, a friend, a coworker, a family member, who has a pattern. When things go wrong, somehow the conversation always ends with you feeling responsible. Even when you entered the conversation knowing clearly that you weren't at fault. They have a way of shifting the frame so gradually, so smoothly, that by the time you realize what happened, you're already apologizing, or justifying, or doubting the version of events you know to be true. And then later, when you're alone and you replay the conversation, you think, wait, how did that happen? How did I end up being the one who felt bad? That experience, that replay, that moment of delayed clarity, is one of the most common signs that someone in your life understands, on some level, how to use your emotions as a navigation tool. Your guilt steers you back. Your anxiety keeps you close. Your need for resolution keeps you engaged. And their behavior, the behavior that created the problem, never really gets examined. The psychological mechanism behind this has a name. It's called emotional weaponization. And it operates through several specific techniques that, once you know them, you will start to see everywhere. The first and most common is guilt induction. This is not the natural guilt you feel when you genuinely do something wrong. This is manufactured guilt, created through exaggeration, through reframing, through the strategic use of silence or disappointment to make you feel responsible for someone else's emotional state. A person skilled at this doesn't have to say, "You made me feel this way," directly. They just have to look a certain way. Go quiet at the right moment. Mention something you did 3 months ago in the middle of an unrelated conversation. The goal is simple. If they can make you feel guilty, they can make you do almost anything to relieve that guilt. And people will do extraordinary things to escape guilt. They'll apologize for things they didn't do. They'll compromise things they believe in. They'll stay in situations they know are damaging because leaving would mean carrying the weight of someone else's manufactured pain. The second technique is what psychologists call intermittent reinforcement. And this one is particularly insidious because it doesn't feel like manipulation. It feels like hope. Here's how it works. A person in your life is inconsistent. Sometimes they're warm, engaged, loving, present. Other times they're cold, distant, critical, or simply unavailable. And the pattern is unpredictable. You never quite know which version you're going to get. Now, from a behavioral psychology standpoint, this inconsistency doesn't make you pull away. It actually makes you more attached. The science here is well established. The same mechanism that makes gambling addictive operates in these kinds of relationships. Your brain becomes wired to chase the positive moments, to work harder for the validation, to interpret the good times as proof that everything is fine and the bad times as temporary. You invest more emotionally not despite the inconsistency, but because of it. And the person creating that inconsistency, whether they understand the psychology or not, ends up with enormous leverage over your emotional state. You are, in the most literal psychological sense, hooked. Let's talk about something that makes all of this significantly more complicated, and that's the fact that most people who use emotional manipulation aren't cartoonish villains sitting in a dark room plotting how to control you. The majority of people who manipulate emotionally do it unconsciously. It's a learned behavior, something they developed in childhood or in early relationships as a survival mechanism. A way to get needs met in environments where direct communication wasn't safe or wasn't effective. This doesn't excuse the behavior. It doesn't mean you should stay in situations that drain you, but it does mean that understanding this shouldn't make you paranoid about everyone in your life. It should make you discerning. There's an enormous difference between someone who occasionally operates from insecurity in ways that affect you and someone who consistently, systematically uses your emotional responses to maintain control. Learning to tell the difference is one of the most valuable skills you can develop. Now, here's where it gets personal, because most people, when they first start understanding emotional manipulation, make one of two mistakes. The first mistake is denial. They apply this knowledge to people they don't know, historical figures, celebrities, characters in movies, but they resist applying it to their actual lives, to the real relationships around them, because acknowledging that someone you love or have invested in is manipulating you is genuinely painful. It requires you to update a story you've been telling yourself about that person, about the relationship, about yourself. The second mistake is overcorrection. They become hypervigilant. They start seeing manipulation everywhere. They pull back from genuine connection because the awareness creates a kind of social paranoia. The goal, and this takes practice, is neither of those responses. The goal is calm, clear-eyed awareness. The ability to look at a pattern of behavior without emotional chaos and ask simply, is this dynamic healthy? Does this person's behavior consistently make me feel smaller, more confused, more guilty, or more desperate for their approval? And if the answer is yes, what am I going to do about that? Here's a truth about emotional manipulation that is rarely said this directly. The moment you stop being emotionally reactive, most manipulation stops working. This sounds simple. It is not easy, but it is the core of the entire defense. When someone tries to induce guilt in you and you don't immediately feel the need to resolve that guilt, when you can sit with the discomfort of someone being disappointed in you without rushing to fix it, the mechanism breaks down. When someone goes cold and silent to punish you and you don't chase, don't beg, don't spiral, the intermittent reinforcement cycle gets interrupted. This is why emotional regulation is not just a mental health concept. It is a power concept. The person who can manage their own emotional state under social pressure is genuinely, functionally harder to control than someone who can't. Not because they feel less why, but because their feelings don't automatically translate into predictable behavior that other people can exploit. Think about what it would actually feel like to operate that way. To be in a conversation where someone is clearly trying to make you feel guilty, And instead of that familiar sinking feeling, you just notice it. You observe what they're doing with a kind of calm clarity. You feel the social pressure they're applying, and you simply don't comply with it. Not aggressively, not with a speech about manipulation, just with a steady, quiet refusal to be moved by something you can see through. That's not coldness. That's not a lack of empathy. That's what it feels like to have your emotional responses under your own authority rather than under someone else's control. And people who interact with a person like that very quickly sense that their usual tools aren't working, that this person isn't going to be steered by guilt or silence or manufactured urgency. And one of two things happens. Either they adjust and the dynamic becomes genuinely healthier, or they move on to find someone easier to affect. Either outcome is better than where you started. There's one more layer to this that I want to cover because it's something that almost nobody talks about. And that's the way we sometimes use our own emotions against ourselves. Not through external manipulation, but through the internal stories we tell about our emotional experiences. When you feel anxious about something, do you ever find yourself amplifying that anxiety by catastrophizing? Imagining the worst possible outcomes until the anxiety is 10 times bigger than the original situation warranted? When you feel hurt by someone, do you ever replay the situation obsessively until the hurt has become a consuming narrative rather than a feeling you move through? This is self-directed emotional weaponization. And it's incredibly common, especially in people who are emotionally intelligent, because the same capacity that allows you to feel things deeply also gives you the raw material to build elaborate internal suffering out of relatively manageable situations. Awareness of this pattern, genuinely catching yourself in the middle of it, is its own kind of protection. Because the question isn't just who is using my emotions against me, but where am I doing this to myself? The work of building genuine emotional intelligence, real emotional literacy, not just the Instagram version of it, involves both directions simultaneously. Learning to recognize external manipulation and learning to regulate your own internal amplification. Both skills develop the same thing, your ability to be the author of your emotional life rather than a character being written by someone else. So, where do you start? You start by paying attention to how you feel after conversations and interactions, not just during them. Because the delayed reaction, that slow-burning confusion, that sense that something was off that you can't quite name, is often more reliable information than your in-the-moment response, which is already being managed by social pressure. You start by noticing patterns rather than isolated incidents. One difficult conversation means nothing. A consistent pattern of feeling guilty, confused, small, or desperate after interactions with a specific person means something. And you start by getting honest with yourself about the relationships in your life where you have been performing emotional gymnastics to keep the peace. Because what looks like patience and maturity from the outside is sometimes just a very well-rehearsed response to being consistently destabilized. This is the work, and it's not dramatic. It doesn't happen overnight. But every time you catch the mechanism, every time you see the play and choose not to react the way it was designed to make you react, you take a small piece of your emotional life back. And those small pieces add up. Until one day you look at a situation that would have wrecked you 6 months ago and you realize, you're just not that easy to move anymore. Here's what I want from you before you go. Think of one relationship or one dynamic in your life right now where you consistently feel like you're working harder emotionally than the situation should require. Where you feel vaguely guilty, vaguely anxious, vaguely responsible for something you can't quite put your finger on. You don't have to share the details, just acknowledge it to yourself. And if you're comfortable, drop something in the comments. It doesn't have to be specific. Even just, I see this in my life, is enough. Because one of the most powerful things about this kind of awareness is realizing you're not alone in it. Most people carrying these dynamics around are carrying them in silence, assuming they're the only one, assuming something is wrong with them. Nothing is wrong with you. You were just never given the map. Share this with someone who needs it. The people who would benefit most from this conversation are usually the ones too deep in it to go looking for it themselves. And if you want to keep building this kind of psychological awareness, the kind that actually changes how you move through the world, stay with us here at Shadow Doctrine. We'll see you in the next one.